1960s were a decade of major technological advancement. Innovations ranging from handheld calculators and ATMs to lasers and space travel made people think that they would be living inside their favorite science fiction stories, quite possibly in their lifetime. Computers were a part of that trend, evolving from one-of-a-kind machines taking up the whole building to a commonplace financial and scientific instrument. It's small wonder that this era got some visionaries who claimed that operating a computer would be a must-have skill by the time today's elementary schoolers would grow up. They claimed that it is time to introduce computers into the education system. In 1962, IBM started a collaboration with education specialists from Westchester County, New York, to experiment with the potential uses of computers in a classroom. Experts from such disparate fields met in a workshop to brainstorm potential ideas. Eventually, they decided to create economic simulations to teach basic economics. During the collaboration, IBM would provide the computers and technical support, but school teachers would be behind making the actual games, trying to make them of educational value. The most well-known game to come out of the project was designed by Mabel Addis, a history teacher who loved turning her lessons into a game, allowing students to role-play historic scenes from different periods of time. She believed that the standard history curriculum of the time understated the importance of the Sumerian civilization, which gave birth to the Western world as we know it, hence the Sumerian Game. Last time we looked at Space War, a computer game which actually has graphics, but it was highly atypical for the time. Most computers would operate on a teletype, an endless roll of paper on which the output of the program is continuously printed. This is the reason most programming languages have a print command, not a display command, by the way. This is a portion of a teletype roll from an IBM 1401 at the Computer History Museum. As you can see, it's from a program which displays powers of 2, and the sheet of paper is long. It's very long. It displays powers of 2 until it runs out of space, basically until the next power of 2 doesn't even fit in this huge sheet of paper. The Sumerian Game was written for the more powerful IBM 1790, but the main moving parts would be similar. The students would use a typewriter to input commands, and they would see the response printed on a teletype. I don't know if there's even one IBM 1790 in the world that is up and running, so today we'll be playing a reconstruction of the game by Andrea Contato, which is freely available on Steam through the link in the description. If you are willing to check the game out, I encourage you to pause the video and do this right now, before you heard my analysis of the game mechanics. The Sumerian Game takes place in the city-state of Lagash in 3500 BCE. The player assumes the role of Ludigas I, the priest ruler of Lagash, and the game is presented as a conversation between the player and his royal steward Urbaba, presenting a report about the state of the economy twice a year. The steward gives you information about the population of your city, the grain supplies and the amount of arable land you have access to. You must then decide how many bushels of grain you should plant and how much grain should be given for people to eat. The game doesn't tell you what a bushel is and how many farmers are needed to tend to an acre of land, and I think that's kind of the whole point. You should figure out the optimal ratios through trial and error. But even if you do stick to optimal ratios, and I'm not gonna spoil what they are, the game doesn't really reward you all that much. Your total harvest seems to be more or less random, depending on the severity of the disaster generated by the game, and it wouldn't be clear just from playing if how much you plant even matters at all. According to the original report by Richard Wang, the Sumerian Game used to have 3 phases, following the history of Lagash under Ludigas I, Ludigas II, and Ludigas III. Quote, in the second phase of the game, the child as Ludigas II is given the opportunity to apply his surplus grain to the development of crafts. In the third and final stage, he is introduced to trade and the more complex problems which confront a changing economy. I say used to have because the report only contains the detailed description of the first phase, which is exactly what this reconstruction follows. So, the original game was trying to illustrate the progress of humanity, kind of like Sid Meier's Civilization 30 years down the line, but we can't really tell how successful the realization of this idea was. We can at the very least infer that these 3 phases were more like 3 separate games. Quote, no matter how a student has directed the city-state through his reign as Ludigas I, he would start his play in the role of Ludigas II with a standard set of values for the state of the nation variables. I can only assume that some sort of technical limitation was preventing them from carrying your progress over between the phases, but we don't know the full story there. If you play the modern reconstruction, the playthrough of Phase 1 should only take you about 10 minutes, but that wasn't the case at all for the 6th grade students playing the Sumerian Game in 1964. Because it's harder to type on a typewriter than on a modern keyboard, and because most of the students had no experience with typing at all, and because the teacher had to explain how to operate the game, the students would take hours to complete the game. In 1967, the project concluded. Richard Wayne has published the final report, and with how few computers there were in existence back in the day, there would be little reason to preserve the Sumerian game. So how come we are talking about it today as a defining moment in video game history? In March 1968, DEC was organizing a conference in Alberta. One of the talks given by Doug Diamond was on the topic of computers in education. It is after talking to other participants after his presentation that Diamond had learned about the Sumerian game. Based on nothing but the rough description, he decided to create a similar game for the PDP-8, which he called King of Sumeria, but it later became known as Hammurabi. The particular details of the story are slightly changed. Instead of Luduga I, leader of Lagash in 3500 BCE, you play as Hammurabi. Note that real Hammurabi, spelled with two M's, lived in the 1800s BCE, and he was not a ruler of a singular city-state, but of a multinational empire. But where King of Sumeria lacks in historical accuracy, it excels at gameplay. For example, it's not hard to figure out the correct ratio of bushels to people in this one. You can do this theoretically. If 75 people starved, then 500 bushels is only enough for 25 people, hence for 100 people I need 2000 bushels. Or you could just do it by trial and error. In addition to spending the grain on food, we now have a new mechanic, which might have been invented by Diamond, or adapted from the second or third phases of the Sumerian game. The player can buy and sell his land, with the price of real estate being random every year. This makes the game a lot more strategic. If you are in a tough situation, instead of just watching your people die like in the original, you have the option to sell all your land, and try to slowly recover later. If you are doing good and the land is cheap, you can spend all your excess grain on expanding your territory. For you see, grain can be eaten by rats, but real estate is indestructible. The PDP-8 was way more accessible than the PDP-1, having sold over 50,000 copies, but it's not like every PDP-8 came with pre-installed Hammurabi. The game is listed on the DEC's program catalog, right in between all the other exciting pieces of software, such as text calculators, random number generators, improved sine-cosine routines, and things like that. If you were a member of DEC User Society, you could order a paper tape of Diamond's game for $5. But in just a few years, Hammurabi would become more accessible than any video games that came before it. By the late 1960s, high-level programming languages such as ALGOL, Fortran, and BASIC were becoming more and more popular. They had an inherent advantage over assembly languages used before, in that a PDP-1 assembly program would run only on the PDP-1, but a Fortran program would run on any computer which supports Fortran. You have to write a special program translating the language for your computer, called the Fortran compiler, but you do it once, and you have access to every single Fortran program in the world. But if you were learning programming in high school at the time, you were doing it in BASIC, which had the reputation of being the most beginner-friendly. King of Sumeria for the PDP-8, however, was written in Focal. This was the language that DEC used, but nobody else did. David All saw the problem, but his higher-ups ignored his pledge to switch to BASIC. So he took upon himself a mission to translate every single game he knew to BASIC, and in 1971, he published this very important book. Now, every person with a computer has access to 101 games, including Hammurabi. The way this works is to take all this code and retype it into your computer. Then you press run, and you and your friends can play the game. It's interesting that David All knows that Hammurabi is spelled with two M's, but he still says the story is set in the city of Sumeria, so the quality of the historical information is still not great. The gameplay of Hammurabi is more or less the same as in Diamond's version, with a few curious additions. First thing you note is that citizens of Babylon are much more ill-tempered, I guess? At the end of the game, there is a message comparing the player to a historical ruler based on his performance. This would be familiar to many retro and modern gamers, as a very similar feature is included in Sid Meier's Civilization games. But the most amazing thing about 101 basic computer games is that having access to the source code allows you to understand game design via a hands-on approach. Change a few numbers here and there, and see what works, and what makes the game too easy, or too difficult, or too boring. With a tool like this, a new generation of game designers would inevitably appear, but that is a story for another decade. Next time, we'll be looking at the lunar lander from 1969. In the meantime, the Beatles would conclude their final tour, Muhammad Ali would be convicted for draft evasion, and most importantly, the moon landing had not just happened, but was artistically recreated in a video game.